Okay, so let's get underway. Welcome to the Metadata Interest Group session for this breakout. The agenda is at the very top of the notes page. So probably don't need 5 minutes for the welcome. I used it for people to come into the room. And next up is progress to date on the metadata standards catalog. So Alec, you want to do that? And I think you can check. Oh, perfect. Okay.
Okay, you can all see my slides now, yes?
Yes.
Excellent. Right. So before I get into the latest news about the metadata standards catalog, I ought to put this work into some sort of context for the benefit of anyone unfamiliar with its long history. The catalogue is the third incarnation of a resource that was originally developed for the UK Digital Curation Centre, or DCC. It was originally designed to help research support staff at UK universities advise researchers on appropriate metadata standards to use when documenting their data sets. The DCC catalogue was launched in 2013, just as the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group was starting up within RDA. So the working group joined forces with the DCC, and the first thing they did was expand the content of the catalogue to make it more appropriate and usable worldwide, and then ported it to GitHub so that it could be maintained by the community. So the Metadata Standards Directory, which is our name for that GitHub version, was launched in 2014. But even so, there were things that we needed the directory to do that couldn't be done on GitHub pages, most notably a machine interface for plugging it into other systems. And we wanted to be able to use it for more detailed analysis of metadata schemes, with the eventual aim of being able to use it to generate converters between arbitrary metadata standards. So that meant it needed to be a dynamic web application rather than a static website. So the Metadata Standards Catalog Working Group was formed, and over the course of 2016 and 2017, we developed the catalog as a dynamic version of the directory. Now, getting the catalog actually operational in production turned out to be something of an uphill battle, but we did get there in the end, and it was quite a learning experience for me personally, at least. So this year, with 3 years of hindsight to help me, I rewrote the catalogue from scratch, and we launched that new version in September. I don't have time to go into all of the changes, but here are a few of the highlights. It's now possible to add relationships between records from either end. So if you have a whole network of records to add, such as a metadata standard and an organization that supports it, and some crosswalks that involve it, you can now add them in any order. The workflow for adding information about versions of metadata schemes, tools, and crosswalks has changed, so that you now reach the screen for editing a version from the display screen of the corresponding record rather than the editing screen. So that gets rid of the problem that we had in version 1 of having to have multiple editing tabs open at once. You can now view the records for organizations, mappings, and endorsements directly, and there are corresponding indexes for them. If you know an entry needs updating but can't remember which standard or tool you saw it in, you'll be able to find it much more easily now. The vocabularies that we used in version 1 for URL types, data types, organization types, tool types, and identifier schemes were either hard-coded or folksonomic, which is to say that you could use any value you liked, but we steered you towards some common terms. In version 2, the terms are strictly controlled, but we now have a dedicated interface for adding new terms. The subject classification we use continues to be read-only, but is now a proper profile of the UNESCO thesaurus, solving some of the problems that we had using the original. The site should now be compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 to AA standard. But if you do encounter any accessibility issues while using the catalog, do please let us know and we'll try and get that fixed. Turning to the API, most of the version 1 endpoints have been removed, but the GET endpoints for the main record types are still available under the old /API addresses to give existing integrations time to migrate. As you can see from the sample on the right-hand side of the screen, these were and are extremely basic. So the new endpoints that I've installed under /API2 are much easier for developers to work with, and I've made them conform as far as possible with the Google JSON style guide. So if you're used to using API calls and Google services, then this style of return response will be already familiar to you. Since relationships between records are held in their own database table, we've introduced some new endpoints for looking them up directly. And now that we've moved from fixed vocabularies to open folksonomies to these new configurable controlled vocabularies, there are new endpoints for looking up the terms that are currently available. And there's a new endpoint for exploring our profile of the UNESCO thesaurus, and the information about the terms is presented as JSON LD, so it can be used directly in linked data applications. I felt that that was enough to be able to launch with, but I will be adding some more features as and when I get the chance. So I will be reintroducing the authenticated API endpoints that allow main records, relationships, and control vocabulary terms to be edited. I'll also be restoring the search interface, but this time in what I believe to be a more RESTful fashion, and I'll be implementing it as a filtering parameter on the GET collection endpoints that I showed you earlier. We've had a request to add fields to record linked data prefixes for applicable metadata schemes, so I'll be looking to add that fairly soon. But arguably more important than all of that is the quality of the information that's held by the catalogue. I'm aware that some of the records have not been touched for quite a few years now and are missing some of the information that we only started to collect recently. So I want to go through them all again and make sure everything is up to date before migrating the information back to the earlier incarnations of the catalogue, and then finally retiring the directory. If you want to help out with that effort, you are most welcome to do that by going to the catalogue and logging in with your RDA website credentials. You can reach the new metadata standards catalogue at the URL on the slide, or by following the links that we've put into our working group page and the page for the metadata interest group. Speaking of which, since April, the metadata interest group has also been making progress on the metadata element set, bringing us a bit closer to be able to use it in the catalogue. But our more immediate aim is to get things ready so we could make the progress unpacking the elements in this very session. So recognizing that it's a lot of work to unpack all the elements at once, we ran a survey over the summer to ask which were the highest priority elements for us to tackle first. And so Rebecca will be talking about the results of that in just a moment. And now on previous occasions where we've asked people to contribute to unpacking the elements, we've been aware not everyone has been exactly sure what the elements are supposed to include and what unpacking them means in practice, which you might see evidence of that when you look at the Google Docs a little bit later on. So what I've done is gone back to the original use case analysis documents from which they were drawn, and used them to add scope notes to the beginning of all the Google Docs to help explain what our original intended semantics were for those elements. And in addition, Keith and I each took one of the high priority elements and wrote a provisional unpacking to give you a flavor of what we're expecting. I believe Keith will go into this in a bit more detail just before we set to work. But before we get to that, I shall hand you back over to Rebecca.
Hello, and my internet went down for part of that, so hopefully it will stay up for this part, and I'll get my slides. And okay, oh, that's not what I wanted. We already know that, but I need to do another one.
Now it seems Rebecca is frozen again. Oh. Ah, here she is.
I know. It's very
sorry.
windy. It's very, oh, and it just said my connection's unstable. So hopefully I will do this quickly. So before I
if I
lost
just
again.
may give a remark to Alex and the metadata standards catalog. In Germany, we are taking up this metadata standards catalog currently at many places. We have the NFDI, the National Research Data Infrastructures, with certain communities. We are taking up the metadata standards catalog and we present it with a different sorting. So, for example, materials community are sorting their elements differently. So we are providing them with a slightly adapted user interface and extending it. So it is a tremendous, a really great piece of work, and we really love to work with it. And Alex, just one question. Everything I just understood that the metadata standards catalog on GitHub, that's open source, and we may do that.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's under an open source license. So yeah,
so it's just great. We are taking it up in a couple of projects, and even in the Helmholtz metadata collaboration platform. Also, there the metadata standards catalog will be used. Thanks a lot.
That's really lovely to hear. It's great to have these adoption stories. Fantastic.
I think we've lost Rebecca again.
Okay, Keith, could you go next? My connection is extremely flaky and I lost it again.
Sure, no problem, will do. Okay, I'll go into presentation mode. Okay, so this is an introduction to the elements and the unpacking of them. But I won't unpack any particular element at the moment, because after this, Rebecca will talk about the survey, and then we get into your participation time. And as an introduction to participation time, Alex and I will demonstrate a bit of unpacking of two important elements. Okay, so we erected from MIG some metadata principles which were approved back at the Amsterdam plenary. Important points: basically metadata and data are the same thing and nothing special about one or the other, because it depends on the way it's used. Think of a library catalog card set. Then to a researcher looking for something, it's metadata. The library catalog card points to the book on the shelf. For the librarian wanting to count the number of books available on biochemistry, it's data. Metadata is not just about data, it's also about users and software services and everything else. It's not just for description and discovery, it's also for contextualization. In other words, how it's possible for a user to utilize the asset that's being described, and many other uses. Metadata must be machine understandable as well as human understandable for autonomicity. So that means formalism of the metadata, which comes down to basically referential and functional integrity and formal syntax and declared semantics. And management metadata is also relevant stuff that is around the area of the research asset that is being described. Things like the original research proposal and the project information and research outputs and outcomes and so on. Right, the FAIR principles you know and love, so I don't think I need to go through them. The metadata element set, first of all, the big point I want to make to begin with is we're talking about elements, not attributes. In other words, these are more complex than punch card columns or spreadsheet columns. It implies they can have internal structure. So for example, the element description can include two sub-elements, which are actually attributes, title and abstract, and indeed others. And similarly, spatial coordinates can include the obvious easting, northing, and altitude, but also precision information. What this implies is there are relationships between and within the elements. And indeed, as stated in FAIR I3, interoperability guideline number 3, then these should be qualified relationships. In other words, they should have semantics explaining what the relationship is. So, for example, originator person is author of the related publication, optionally with a temporal interval for which this triple or assertion is true. And so the important point here is that the is author of is a semantic relationship. And that means that we have a richer way of dealing with metadata by having some complexity in the elements. So what we end up with is a fully connected graph between and within the elements, which gives us rich semantics on the edges between the vertices of the graph. Here's the list of the metadata elements that have been proposed and have been modified a little over the course of the last, I don't know how many plenaries, about 10, I think. Unique ID, location, description, keywords, temporal coordinates, spatial coordinates, originator and project, facility or equipment, quality, that raises all sorts of problems, by the way, availability, including things to do with licensing and persistence, provenance, again, a huge complex area, citations, related publications, related software, the schema, and the medium or format. All of these describing the digital object, the asset being described by the metadata. So some final remarks. We're still lacking detail despite a lot of work at various previous plenaries where people have kindly sat in little groups and talked about the different elements. And I don't know whether you noticed, but on each of the previous elements, there is attached to it a bit.ly URL, and that takes you to a Google Doc where there's been discussion in between plenaries as well as at plenaries on all the elements. There's more work to do, but some characteristics are emerging. I've mentioned already the relationships between and within elements and their semantic description. There's a need for classification on many of the elements concerning the properties of the entity. For example, medium really requires a classification scheme or a set of valid values of that attribute. And for roles in relationships with the entity with others. In other words, things like owner, and these probably need to be within an ontology that's rich enough to manage not only subterms and superterms and other related terms, but also to manage multilinguality. So a plea from me, indeed on behalf of the three co-chairs of MIG, please comment on the Google Docs. And you can find those URLs of all the Google Docs on the MIG page at RDA. Thanks, and I hand back over to Rebecca. Of course, if there's any questions, immediately let me know. Okay, Rebecca, all yours.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my camera this time in hopes of staying alive long enough to do the survey. Okay, so we did a survey, and the intent of the survey was to find out what the highest priorities are. Since there are so many elements, we wanted to try to tackle them in an order that had the most interest. So I did this survey, and turns out the top element of interest is the unique identifier, which is one of the reasons that we have done this, and we'll show you how the unpacking of this one went. So for the second one, priority 2 wasn't quite as clear. Location, in other words, the URL was a little bit higher than description. And then when it came down to the third, then there wasn't a lot of agreement. So the top one, it was really interesting to see that most people agreed on that. But by the time you get down to third and fourth, the slices of the pie get tinier and tinier. So that was the results of the survey. And now we can go on and show you how to do unpacking. And let me stop sharing my screen.
I just butt in with a question, Rebecca.
Sure.
How many responses did you receive?
Let's see, I think it was right around 40. So not huge given how many people are in our interest group, but still it wasn't, it was nice to see some responses, but it's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions before we go on to the next section?
Hey, Rebecca, this is Ted.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, could someone who knows where it is put the link to those unpacking URLs in the chat? I'm looking in the working group page on RDA and I can't find them. Thanks.
Okay. Just a second. So you want the list that was on Keith's slide?
Well, Keith had all these URLs, but he then at the end he said that they were on the working group page at RDA, and that's what I'm looking for. That sort of set of
Okay.
links.
All right, let me go find that, and we can go on to, oh, Alex did it already. So I want to make sure, is that what you were talking about?
So that's the Google Drive folder that has all of the Google Docs in it.
Okay.
And that link is also available from the collaborative notes.
Thank you.
Yep, it's there.
Okay, so next up.
That's me, yeah?
Yes.
Right, just checking, make sure I'm getting it in the right order. Okay, so this is to give you an idea of the sort of discussions that have been going on the element identifier. Just going to full screen. Okay, there's a lot of discussion about what an identifier is, and if you look at the Google Doc, you see there's been some interesting comments and discussions about it. But I think what we're really talking about is universally unique, resolvable, persistent identifiers. That is, identifiers that persist, they don't change, they're resolvable, they convert or can be resolved to an address, they are unique. In other words, the thing that they're identifying is absolutely unique, and it's universal, not just global, because of course we have digital objects in space. The key point here is that it must be all these things to work in an autonomic environment. Now, a problem is that for a given digital object represented a real world object, or indeed not, a conceptual object, there may be multiple identifiers. So if you consider the digital representation of a person, they're likely to have different IDs, and each of these IDs are in fact role-based. So for example, you might have a passport, and that is role-based in that it's a permit to travel, a driving license for driving, and so on. And each of these identifies the, in this case, person, and not necessarily uniquely universally. So it may be that if we're accessing, interoperating, and reusing a digital object, we may have to deal with different IDs for the same digital object. So from this, it makes sense to have a semantic-free base identifier, which has qualified references in the fair sense, i.e. semantic attributes, to the role-based IDs, the IDs that are linked with a specific role, such as travel for passport and driving for driving license. So this is what's known as the federated ID concept, and it's surprisingly widespread as a requirement. It's also, of course, useful if the ID can be incorporated in a URL, an address, to form a way in which the ID resolves to location, where the digital object of interest is located. There are nuances to do with versioning and provenance, which are actually quite difficult, but these can also be dealt with by the concept of qualified references, i.e. the I3 concept of FAIR. An important point to underline is that identifier and address are not the same thing. They are two different things. So your mobile phone number doesn't identify you as a person, except for a time period during which that is allocated to you, and so on. So if we're going to unpack unique identifier, then we need a sub-element, which is the base identifier, which is semantic free, universally unique and persistent. There may be additional sub-elements, which are other identifiers, which have embedded semantics relating to their role and purpose linked to the base identifier by qualified references. So linking from some semantic free identifier to a passport number with a semantic rich link, a qualified reference in FAIR terms, which explains the purpose for which the passport identifier is used. Then finally, there should be a mechanism for embedding the base identifier and indeed the other identifiers in a URL string to provide the resolution and thus the address of the digital object identified by the identifier. So the desiderata for an identifier, it should be a UUR PID, not an address and vice versa. Ensure the relationship between the ID and the address is qualified, as in FAIR I3, interoperability criterion 3. Have no semantics. In other words, there shouldn't be identification of an organization or anything like that embedded in the base ID. And it should have a simple syntax. In other words, it's not containing structure. And it should require no human management system to ensure uniqueness. Oops, sorry. And that was it. Any questions or comments? Absolute silence. And
No, so Keith, this is just an example. Hi, Rob, of course. Yep. Hi. You're taking the identifier, but this holds for other things as well, or my misunderstanding?
No, this was just an unpacking of the identifier element. Yep. Because that has these particular properties that it needs to be universally unique and so on.
Yeah. So yesterday I attended a session from the from a PIT group, and none of this was talked about there. So I think we need to make sure that that there are some overlapping attendance.
Absolutely. I think we need to join that up. I mean, what I've just presented is based on the comments in the Google Doc, the comments given verbally at previous RDA plenaries and previous meetings of the metadata interest group. So I tried to do was summarize everything that had come my way, at least, about identifiers. But of course, this is very much open for further discussion, and anyone can add comments to the identifier Google Doc. And we can continue to take those into account.
Just to continue this question, Keith, do you think that the PID in the handle system fulfills the criteria?
I can't think of any system which has perfect, universally unique, resolvable, persistent identifiers. So I think, as usual, we're dealing at the moment with the art of the possible, not the art of the desirable.
Keith, hello.
Jan has got his, Jan has got his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. How does the URI, universal resource identifier, come into this picture?
I've had wonderful discussions years ago with Tim Berners-Lee exactly about this. I was heavily against the concept of URI because I mean, a URL is an address, and using it as an identifier is incredibly dangerous for the sort of reasons I've mentioned. Joachim?
Yeah, I thought I knew something about PIDs and metadata before I came here, but not, since I worked with them last 5 years, but now I realize I don't know anything. What I think that some of those criteria that you put up are mutually, there is a conflict between some of them. For example, you ask for a simple syntax while having that at the same time as you're supposed to be universally unique. It will surely demand very long strings, as I understand it, that compose these to guarantee universal uniqueness. So I've been thinking in terms of namespaces and shorter strings within those namespaces that are identifiable. The way that you have, for example, you know about Miriam, the registry with identifiers.org, where you can register a kind of regular expression that can be used to identify what kind of identifier or PID this is, in what namespace is it. But now, so I really don't understand how you should get to these universally unique strings without having some kind of namespaces or domains for it.
Okay, are you familiar with the concept of a UUID?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they claim that with, from memory, 96-bit identifier, they can guarantee uniqueness to some huge number.
Yeah, but I know that they also have their flaws, and you know that there are, I think they're up to version 5 now, and I'm not sure that it will stop there. So
no, I think you're right. I think this is a moving target.
Yeah.
But the advantage of having a URPID that has no semantics and simple syntax is that people don't, people are encouraged then to use other elements or attributes in the metadata for things like searching.
Yeah, but
that's the advantage. Okay, thanks, Joachim. Maggie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Keith, maybe we should cut this particular discussion short because you have many more metadata fields than just identifiers. I just wanted to say that I think what is required here is a number of worked out examples, really showing concrete real world cases which are illustrating what it is that you are saying now, not only about the identifier, but also about the other metadata fields. And then I think people can really relate to what it means. And you could also make a list of this is what you should not be doing. That can also be as illustrative as because just describing it with words becomes a bit abstract, I think.
I understand, but on the other hand, we didn't really want, as metadata interest group, to tell people what to do. We wanted to try to bring together a summary of best practice, best ideas from the people involved in the group, of course.
Yes, but you need to facilitate the process of understanding what it is you are saying in the minds of those people who should be taking up the message.
Okay, we'll take that on board. Thanks a lot. I'm looking to see if there's any more hands.
Chris did have his hand up. Yes. It just went up again.
Hi, my name is Chris Rush. I'm a graduate student from Drexel University. I had a question about one of the things that we've been working with is from the California Digital Library, these ARCs, which the the guidelines do say that they should be opaque, but they are relegated to institutions. So each institution would be responsible for its own metadata and would respond with, would respond to a particular object, but it does have a unique identifier for the institution. Is that still opaque? If there's, like, they call it a NAN, an identifier for Drexel, say, is a certain number, but then the rest of the identifier for the object is not semantic, does that violate the rules?
It certainly does, in a sense. I mean, because you can presumably deduce the institution from the identifier. So it's a kind of namespace partitioning on institution. Now, that may be a practical way to do things. It may be what we have to do, but it does have the disadvantage that people will then use that part of the identifier to identify the institution rather than other parts of the metadata where there'll be, for example, the relationship of the institution to the digital object, such as owner, manager, creator, and so on. So if it is used in that way, and of course people may not use it in that way, but if they do use it in that way, i.e. identifying the institution from part of the identifier, then rich semantics and qualified references in the fair sense are lost. Okay, thanks.
Did you see Rob's comment in the chat box?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I know. It's yeah, I understand the problem exactly. Yeah, I agree. Semantics change, and therefore we need mechanisms of attaching semantics to opaque or neutral identifiers. Thanks, Rob.
Are there any more questions? Let's see. Okay, so my co-chairs are going to be really happy to hear this. I'm no longer a host because I dropped off too many times. And Alex, you are the host, so you are in charge of breakout rooms.
Oh,
I hope you can, surprise. So I hope you can see that there should be an icon down at the bottom for breakout rooms. And what we were hoping to do next is I'll show a slide on which elements need some unpacking. And what we were hoping to do is break out into breakout rooms. And what I would like to discuss right now is how do we want to choose which element to work on. And oh, Rob, that's not fair. I like Alex being host. At any rate, I'm going to show you the list. And while I'm doing that, then we can talk about what's the best way to break out, because I don't want to assign people. I would rather they get to select what they want to do. Let's see. Share. Okay, so okay, based on the survey, these were the ones that came up higher than the ones on the right. So location, keywords, originator, availability, spatial coordinates, temporal coordinates. And then the other ones usually had very small slices of the pie. And I know that when we did the presentation in, I think it was Helsinki, with the fair data maturity model people, two of the elements that had the most discussion because they're hard were quality, which I agree that one's difficult, and provenance. So given this list, how would you like to break up into groups? I'm open to suggestions. Do you want to try and do one together, or do you want to go in separate groups and work on it, your favorite, together?
Rebecca, why don't we ask Alex to go through how he did description, because he did it quite formally, and that might be an example, and it might provoke people into saying, if that's how we do description, then I'd like to do spatial coordinates or whatever.
Okay, I will stop sharing my screen. Yes, random assignment is possible. Let me stop. Okay, Alex?
Yep, okay, I will start sharing mine. Do you see that? There we go. So the way Keith unpacked Identifier, I think, was sort of focused on one of the use cases for the metadata element set, which is a kind of prescriptive one where we're outlining the best practice for people who are setting out on the road of forming a new domain metadata standard. The approach I took was looking more at the other use case that we had for it, which is to analyze existing ones, and trying to use that as a basis for being able to form converters between arbitrary metadata standards. And let's say what we're trying to unpack here are the semantics for elements and some syntax for how they're represented. So what I did here was just literally kind of do that, and I had a section on semantics and a section on syntax. So with description, what we'd intended for this to be was a description being any kind of free text, any portion of free text that described the data set or a particular aspect of it. And so we were including things that may not immediately leap to your mind in that, but things like title, which if it's a good title, should actually give a succinct description of what is in the data set. So as well as the text itself, there are other properties that I think will need to be recorded about that portion of free text, such as the language and perhaps dialect in which that was written, the role that's being played by it, is it being a title or an abstract, and any sort of formatting conventions that are being used in the text. So if I just scroll down quickly, you see I've outlined title, abstract, methodology, sort of table of contents, or some free text navigational aid for how to navigate through a data set, or more technical information, which could be a description of hardware or software that could be used to render the data set. And then a kind of miscellaneous, which I've called note. And then then further down, we've got the syntax, where I've set out a suggestion for how we might want to represent these sort of properties when we're analyzing metadata standards. So I suggested there that we use the codes from IETF BCP 47. So that's things like, ES for Spanish and ENGB for British English. That the type should be a controlled vocabulary. The format should be a controlled vocabulary. And here I think I'm just clarifying what I mean by format in this instance. It is about markup being used to put into some extra detail into how the text is being intended, which there are several different conventions that could be used: Markdown, REST, HTML, and so on. And then the final bit is where we've actually tried to test this in practice by comparing it to some real life metadata standards. So what I've done is try to analyze some of the elements from the DataCite metadata kernel there, and further down I've compared it against Dublin core terms. So so this is the kind of unpacking that is going to be useful, certainly for me, when I come to try and incorporate this kind of logic into the metadata standard catalog, for providing this kind of neutral and uniform analysis of the specifications of different metadata schemes. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Chris, did you have a question?
No, I don't know if I left my hand up on.
Oh, okay, just trying to watch. Okay, now that we've seen that, if I do breakout rooms, if they're automatic, there would be 4 of them with 6 to 7 participants per room. Did I miss a question? So are there 4 elements that people would like to work on?
So why don't you just go ahead and decide on 4 and assign people to it, and then we'll just see what comes up. I think
Okay.
time is limited, so we need more of a dictator approach here.
Okay, dictator
Sorry,
coming up.
would it be possible to show the list again, please?
Yes. One moment. Let's see. Share screen. I have to find it. There we go. All right, share screen. And oops. Okay, and let me get this. So all of these are available. The ones on the left just had a few more. Let's see if I can see. Does that help? Let's see.
Well, I think if you're going to pick 4, I think the meteor ones on the left-hand side are probably Originator, which was perhaps broader than it sounds, which was intended to cover any sort of agent with some responsibility for the data set. Availability, which included things like licensing, and the spatial and temporal coordinates, which, as well as the actual specification of a region of space and time, would also be looking at things like precision and accuracy.
Oh, yes. Yeah, location can be, and that's the URL. Okay, so following. Oh, I didn't put down ones that have been unpacked. So I didn't put unique identifier in here or description because those have been done, but they could be redone. All right, I will follow Maggie's suggestion and let's do keywords, availability, citations, and project. So if I'm going to be a true dictator, I will automatically assign rooms, and let's see what happens. Okay, room 1 will be location. Room 2 will be availability. Room 3 will be keywords. And room 4 will be project citations. I think I mixed those up. Anyway, location, keywords, availability, and citations. And we can go around and...
Rebecca, will you reassign if we request?
Yes, yes, of course. I'm not a good dictator, but I try. Okay, so location, keywords, and let's do them in order, despite what I just said. Location is 1, keywords is 2, availability is 3, and citations, you should get this message in a minute, is 4. Okay, and you should all be in a breakout room. Did that work? Or do I have to move you? Okay.
Yeah, Rebecca, just to confirm, I have an invitation to join a breakout room. So that's obviously working so far. I'll now go and join it and leave this.
Okay, yeah, I can finally see that I'm the only one left here, and I'll walk around. Let's see. It looks like most are back from the breakout rooms. So who from breakout room would like to report out what their group was doing?
Yeah, so this is Maggie. I can just say that we tried to put some notes into the collaborative notes document about what we were talking about. And it's a little bit messy because trying to type at the same time as talking or thinking is not recommendable. But so we were mainly beginners to this field. So there was really no thematic expert. So we got stuck in discussions about definitions and what was what, etc. But some interesting things that came up was that one thing was, so this is very stuck to the internet protocols of today, but we were wondering if there were other ways of specifying a location which doesn't necessarily follow into the syntax that is covered in the present version of the definitions document. So that's something maybe to think about. We were concerned that there could be changes in say, an HTTP protocol, so that maybe it is also important to note as an attribute to the respective elements the version of the protocol that is being defined or used. Also, so details such as the delimiters which are allowed for each protocol, they could conceivably change or slightly change meaning, or new ones could be added. So it's important to ensure backwards compatibility. Otherwise, older metadata records could become unactionable or unreadable. Yes, I think that those are just some examples of what it is, what we were talking about. But overall, the sense was, why do you really need to mess with breaking up a location into parts? Isn't the whole just enough? Just as was already commented by Ted Haberman and others in the original document.
Okay. Thank you. Report out from room 2.
Yeah, I'm Chris again from Drexel University. We discussed keywords and the relationship to finding aids, and we had a little bit of difficulty because the application, it depends on the application really, like the standards that you apply to keywords. Well, on the one hand, in data sets, there's a different, and hopefully somebody can jump in a little bit here, that they should enhance discovery of the keywords, and that they should be describable as RDF and semantically. But but mostly the consensus of the group was that we needed to define a little better what a keyword was in relation to subject. And that may be in the documentation, but we didn't really get a chance to read through all of it. It's not in the specific document, but we'd like a narrower, we'd like to come up with a narrower or a more specific definition of keyword. I know it's, you know, the information says that there's standard classes in different metadata schemas, but I think they're defined differently. So we didn't really have consensus, I guess, in my report.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Breakout room 3, report out.
Yes, hello. So we were considering availability, which turned out not to be a too clear notion. We were thinking about perhaps changing it to something slightly different. In particular, the short abstract named access arrangements, restrictions, conditions, and costs, licensing and other usage restrictions and conditions, and retention policy at the same time. So one of our suggestions is to move retention policy to some other element or element group, because it's mainly concerned with the management of the resource, not with its potential use. And we also discussed that the license does supply a part of the restrictions, conditions, and costs, but there may be other aspects that need to be specified separately. And the technical way of accessing a resource, that's yet another thing to specify within the scope of availability or accessibility, or whatever name is the best one for this element.
Great, thank you, Jan. Breakout room 4.
Yes, so again, in the spirit of rebellion, we were hoping to narrow the scope of the citation element to be talking specifically about the way in which the resource in question should be cited, and to the other thing that was originally intended for this element was elements that list citations of the current resource in other resources, and we thought that actually we could, I mean, it's more of a subset of the kind of relationship that the current resource has with related publications and possibly other types of resource as well. And so it would be better if that was reflected in the element set. So when we are talking about related resources, then citation is one of the relationships that the other resource could have. And we can provide a more granular typology below that, something like the citation type ontology for describing what that citation is actually doing, whether it's saying that it's actually using it, or whether it is saying that it's a bad thing, or those kinds of things. So unpacking the semantics of these citation elements themselves, there are several ways of looking at it, one of which is to try and break it down into all of its individual components, and the other is to try and build it up into a string that can be used as a reference in a publication. And we can conceivably metadata schemes might do one or the other, or perhaps both. So what will we need to know about these things? If it's a fully formatted sample citation, then it might be useful then to specify the style that citation is written for, so whether that is obeying APA rules or MLA or some other scheme. And we then thought about what kind of elements might contribute to that citation. So we're thinking things like creator, title, publication year, identifier, publisher, location, version, those kinds of things. All of which might be reproducing information that's held elsewhere in the metadata element set. But so the value of having it here under citation is to be able to specify what is the kind of preferred value to use when you are citing it. So, we were saying there is a push to get a greater variety of credit for the different contributors to something like a data set, not only the sort of mainline principal investigator, but also the people who processed it, and the data curators and data managers and so on. Those are all valid things that we can record under originator. So but there's usually going to be a subset of those that would actually be specified in a citation. And so this element here in semantics would say which of those originators would be present in a citation. And that was about as far as we got, though we did mention some other related work that we need to look into, for example, open citation identifiers. And we started looking at where some of these elements might appear in metadata schemes in the wild. RIF CS, for example, has a citation info element.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we are coming to the end of the session. Keith, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we close?
No, just thanks to everyone for participating actively. I think we've moved thinking forward a little bit, and don't stop now. Now you know where all the information is. Please put comments in the Google Docs, and effectively for the next plenary, we should have made a big step forward. Thank you.
And I will put links to any of the slides that were presented into the meeting notes. And then there'll be a link from the Metadata Interest Group webpage to these meeting notes. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks to the chairs
Thanks for
for
chairing,
the nice
Rebecca.
meeting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Been a great meeting.
Yes.
Thanks to all. Bye for now.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Thank you. Bye bye.